afternoon, wherever in the world you're joining us from today. Welcome to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Expo Europe. My name is Jeremy Snyder. Today, I'm going to be talking about shifting to a holistic cloud security strategy. So let's dive in. We've got a lot to get through in the next 20 minutes or so. So let's not beat about the bush. Let's drive right in. So just a few words about myself to kind of get started. As I said, my name is Jeremy Snyder. I think the most important things that I'd like to say about myself is that, one, I've been doing nothing but cloud for the last 10 years. So since the very, very early days of cloud security, I have been helping organizations around the world migrate to the cloud in a secure way, and with a focus on kind of getting it right as they go. So not just embracing the same old operating models, but really transitioning into more of a cloud-centric view of things. So let's talk about the cloud, what's different about it, how it's different, why people are moving up to it, and so on. So why are companies moving to the cloud? So I found this article from CIO Magazine, and I thought it was really interesting because the author, a guy called Bernard Golden, talks about really there being two kinds of agility that organizations get when they shift to the cloud compared to the old way of operating. So the first kind is just the speed of deployment. If you think about kind of let's say an old school IT ticketing driven process, I request a virtual machine that goes into an approval queue, gets approved, gets spun up by somebody in IT or in operations. And in, 4 weeks to 4 months, I get an email telling me that there's an IP address and my virtual machine is available. And then I can go in there, install software, and do whatever I need to do with that piece of infrastructure. Well, if we think about cloud environments, we go from that kind of 4-week process to a process where I get access to a console, I click a few buttons, select the sizing of the virtual machine and some configuration options, and within 4 minutes, I can have that same infrastructure ready to go. And I might even be able to wrap into that deployment process a pre-installation of any number of commercial third-party or open source components in line with that process. So just really accelerating the process from the time that a need is identified to the time that that need is fulfilled. That's the first kind of benefit, just the overall speed. But the second kind, I would argue, is actually even more relevant and even more compelling for organizations, and that's business flexibility. So if we think about kind of what's happening, some of the macro trends in technology around the world today, one of the big ones is the accumulation of data. Organizations are gathering data at unprecedented scale and unprecedented speed. The other thing that's happening, if you've ever heard of kind of the 3 V's of big data, velocity, variability, and volume, the variability, right? So the shape of the data that we're gathering is something that we've never seen before. We're seeing data of all kinds, everything from click streams to, let's say, purchase records, through social media interactions, unstructured communications, et cetera. So the data that you need to process tomorrow may be different than the data that you're able to process today. And that might dictate required changes in your infrastructure or required changes in your computing environment. And that's actually the flexibility that cloud can deliver to your organization. So if what you need to account for tomorrow is different than what you do today, no problem. Just spin up that new infrastructure that you need, and you can actually spin down the infrastructure that you're using today, walk away from it, kind of no harm, no foul, no additional ongoing maintenance cost or depreciation, amortization, any of that. And that gives businesses the ability to adapt. And I think, in 2020, all of us will recognize that the ability to adapt is a key value in the modern kind of global IT landscape. So those are kind of the two main value points of why companies are moving to the cloud. They really boil down to agility. And like I said, the flexibility angle is the key value in my mind. So lest we all think that this is a small thing or that this isn't growing, I think we all know, we're here today because we recognize that the cloud has been growing like crazy. There had been kind of a background 18% year over year growth rate happening on its own. But I think an interesting data point is that only 38% of 38% of workloads are in public cloud today. So we actually have a long way to go, and this is on top of a market that's already, a multi-hundred billion dollar market. AWS, I just cherry picked one simple stat here to kind of indicate the scale of the public cloud market today. Quarterly revenue is already over $35 billion, and you can extrapolate out from there what annualized revenue is, and then think about, the other players in the market like Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, and so on. And you get the sense very quickly, this is a multi-hundred billion dollar market. and it is just kind of, below 50% still at this point. But as I said, 2020 has been this kind of weird year, and it's accelerated even further under COVID-19 as all of us, have shifted to working online, working remotely, working from home, avoiding social contact and, potential spread of the virus. So we've seen some really interesting trends this year. One organization that published a case study around how they've shifted actually a government service. They've gone from 50% of consumer, business process. Think of this as things like, issuing deeds, driver's license, requests for, I don't know, court transcripts, things like that. From 50% to 90% going online in 2 quarters, right? And that's just dramatic acceleration, especially in a public sector context. And then, we had that 18% year over year growth rate on cloud uh, as a background stat. Coming into this year, it actually jumped from 18 up to 37% versus the same quarter last year. So dramatic growth and then even further acceleration happening this year. And this is leading to a rush to the cloud, which is starting to expose, I think, some of the key challenges around cloud security. So let's talk about cloud security and let's talk about, how some of the operating models might need to adapt. So if we go back, let's say pre-cloud, maybe that's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, depending on your organization, what did organizations do for data center colocation or, server security? When I talk to companies, the two things that come out time and again are network focus and server focus. And if we're honest about it, that what that really translates to is firewall and things like endpoint agents. Endpoint agents like antivirus, anti-malware, things like that, maybe a web application firewall at the server layer. Well, those are really powerful tools, but they really rely on a strategy that's oriented around keeping bad actors out of your environment, protecting your perimeter, if you will. If the bad actor cannot get in, then we're safe. Once the actor gets in, things are relatively open, with the exception of maybe, trying to defend against malware at the endpoint. That model needs to change. And that, I think, the thinking behind that model needs to change, in particular when we think about a cloud architecture. So here I've taken a reference architecture from AWS. This is a very simple reference architecture. It's designed to kind of replicate that simple data center environment with just kind of a internet-facing gateway. Think of that as your perimeter, and then some simple server endpoints sitting behind that. And the question very quickly becomes, where are the security controls of this environment? I like to do a pop quiz around this when I have the opportunity to talk to audiences live, and just ask, how many security controls are in this simple architecture. And I mean, you can cheat and look at the left-hand side and you can see there's already over 20 security controls here. But the other thing I'll point out is that it's also a question of having the perimeter being devolved a little bit away from being that network edge. All of the components that we're looking at here and the subcomponents attached to them have potential kind of perimeter exposure, if you will. If you think about, let's say, those server endpoints or virtual machine endpoints, EC2 instances in this case, in this diagram, each of them has a fixed disk storage attached to it called an EBS volume that has snapshots associated with it. It's really difficult in a traditional data center environment for me to make one backup on one disk on one disk or one tape, to take that one backup and make it public when I've got all the layers of security in between, or all the network layers in between, and I've got a perimeter at the edge. But in a cloud environment, I can absolutely do that. I can take one EBS snapshot, make that public, make that open to the world. So you can see, there's a perimeter component to a number of the resources behind the scenes or behind that internet facing gateway. The second thing is the question of what are endpoints here. So in this diagram, we've got very, very simple endpoints, those EC2 instances that we can see up and down this stack here. But you'll notice that we also have gateways and we have load balancers. In a traditional environment, those might have been network devices, but very often they're actually server devices. And so they would have standard endpoint kind of security models applied to them. In a cloud environment, these are abstracted resources that have no accessible operating system associated to them. So, what can you protect on those assets? We're going to come back to the question about endpoints a little bit later when we talk about kind of the shift to a cloud operating model. But just bear that in mind. It's one of the questions that comes up very often is, how do you think about applying an approach like endpoint security to a cloud environment? And last, before we shift into a couple other things, just in case you didn't think this is a big problem, just a couple things I want to highlight here, and the slides will be available for anybody who wants all the data points. There is something called the shared responsibility model in a cloud environment, and that shared responsibility model says, what does the cloud provider do for you, and what do you have to do for yourself? The way to think about it is that the cloud provider ensures the security of the cloud environment, but you, the customer, have to ensure your own security inside the cloud environment. And based on the research we've done from the last couple of years, analyzing hundreds of cloud data breach incidents, 95% or more of cloud breaches are actually the fault of the customer. And the vast majority of them come down to something called misconfiguration that we're going to talk about later on. Just from a scale perspective, 33.4 billion records exposed over the last couple of years. The number of major breaches is actually rising year to year. And then, like I said, most of these problems are things like open storage, misconfiguration, et cetera. So for those that are really curious about kind of the architecture angle, where are the main problem points? Actually, for many years in a row, AWS S3, which is this kind of bucket over here. Think of this as a virtual disk drive in the sky or a virtual folder in the file in the cloud where you can stash files. This has been the main vulnerability point where organizations have misconfigured access or access controls to those buckets to expose storage. We've seen a rise of comparable services on Azure Blob, starting to have data breaches around them as well. But lest you think that storage is where all of the problem lies, in particular, the modern NoSQL databases are also starting to be implicated in these data breaches. So things like Elasticsearch, MongoDB, et cetera. One kind of tip before we get into a good security strategy is to think holistically, and we're going to talk about that as part of the overall theme of the presentation, shifting to a holistic strategy. And finally, I just want to do one quick case study before we shift into that, into some recommendations. So last year, Capital One had a massive data breach. 100 million Americans, 6 million Canadians had their data exposed. Interesting thing about this is it was a multi-vector attack. We're going to walk through the steps in just a second. But it came down fundamentally to the cloud configuration layer after the application layer was breached. So if we play this out, we'll see that the first thing that happened was a virtual machine was compromised because of a vulnerability in the application running on top of that virtual machine. That gave access to the underlying virtual machine. That virtual machine had a set of permissions associated with it that allowed the bad actor to break out from that virtual machine, access data storage in the AWS environment, and then exfiltrate the data. So if we play that out step by step, we'll see that, first access came in from the internet to the web server, from the web server out to the S3 bucket, and taking data from that S3 bucket out to the world. So I highlight this one in particular because I think this, more than any of the other events we've analyzed over the last few years, really emphasizes the need for a holistic approach. So let's talk about the shift in the operations model and how it can inform a security strategy. Back in the good old days, we used to have, the design and build phase, and then you would often hear the phrase, "Hey, let's chuck it over the wall into production. Let's give it to the operations team, and they're going to take care of it." And that operations team, they had a number of responsibilities that fell outside of the development environment. So that would be things like patching servers, fixing problems, remediating vulnerabilities, responding to security incidents, and so on. But when we go to the cloud, you'll hear about DevOps. And DevOps is this idea that actually we get that agility that we talked about earlier when we start to allow development teams direct access to cloud environments. And we really bring the concept of development and operations together. We get rid of that great wall dividing the teams that we saw on the last slide. And we go into more of kind of a left to right time-oriented process. Planning, coding, building, testing, releasing, deploying, operating, and monitoring. One thing that you won't see in a DevOps environment is you won't see a lot of patching and fixing in the operations environment. Why? Because the idea is that as we get into a model of treating our virtual machines as more immutable infrastructure that should be replaced on an ongoing basis, we eliminate the need for active patching and active server management in our operating and our production environments. And if we combine that with this, kind of more and more popular idea that we should collapse security into that development process or into that DevOps process, what you'll hear is this new buzzword DevSecOps. You'll see that we get to a very similar process, but now it becomes more of a circular process, right? So we go from that same kind of plan, build, test approach to start off the process into a validation for security and controls in a deployment and a monitoring, post-deployment monitoring activity that leads us to then kind of react to incidents, stabilize, and then analyze incidents as they're happening, and let that inform the next iteration on this path. So it's a really interesting concept, and it's actually, I think, the path to getting the most out of your cloud journey is if you can get your organization to adapt to a DevSecOps approach. If you're interested, look up a guy called Larry Macaroni, L Macarone on Twitter. He has some great concepts and some great annotations around this. So let's talk about getting it right. Well, the cloud is changing security by giving us kind of a new pace of innovation and disruption. I think in the past, if we think about how we've adapted security tools to our environments, it's all about managing risk. And we manage risk by knowing that there is risk in our environment. So that's kind of the first step. We know that we have certain technologies running. We think about what are the tools that we can use to mitigate that. And that becomes our managed security risk, kind of the orange that we see here. Well, what we're seeing in cloud environments is that there are new services, new ideas, and there is a much more rapid pace going on. And that's introducing this gap that we talk about here, the security achievement gap. So I've taken this concept and I've tried to break it down on a couple axes here. We've got the time scale and we've also got the technology innovation. But when we think about that in a practical sense, the time view on operations, it's obviously build and operate, right? When we think about the stack view, it breaks down into infrastructure and application. And when we start to actually put those two things together and we consider the full infrastructure stack in a cloud environment, working from the cloud provider through the hypervisor, then getting out of what the cloud provider does for you, kind of getting into your share of the shared responsibility model, you see the components that you need to think about. What I've tried to do is I've tried to break that down into kind of a 2x2 grid, if you will, that you can think about. So a holistic cloud security strategy takes that time scale and looks from the build into the operate, and then looks at the infrastructure layer and the application layer on top of that. And what I've done here is I've tried to pick out kind of the 4 key components that I think inform a holistic cloud security strategy. So let's talk about the build phase. It starts with actually looking at the infrastructure and then the application. On the infrastructure side, we're seeing that leading organizations that are embracing DevOps and DevSecOps are moving away from kind of simple point and click infrastructure operations. And they're moving to something called IAC, infrastructure as code. And so from a security perspective, what they're doing is pre-deployment, they're scanning their infrastructure as code templates and environments for misconfigurations that we know lead to the vast majority of cloud data breaches. So they're scanning those before deployment, and they're coupling that with code scanning and vulnerability management so that they know that that immutable infrastructure that they're putting out there, when it gets in the operating system and application layers, they're doing their best to eliminate all known vulnerabilities and issues pre-deployment. Now, once we get into the deployment, what do we need to do? There's 2 key tool sets that come into play here. On the infrastructure layer, it is something called CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management. So this is actively monitoring all of the cloud infrastructure environment as those deployments are happening and new infrastructure is being brought into those environments. That can look for problems, that can look for those misconfigurations that lead to the data breaches, couple that with application layer workload protection, which is kind of the modern evolution of endpoint protection, and application scanning. Application scanning you can think of as kind of penetration testing done on an ongoing continuous basis against your application environments, because those application environments will look very different from in the past, where you have like all those multi-service and multi-resource type architectures that we saw on previous slides. So that's kind of the 2x2 grid, if you will, for a holistic cloud security strategy. Thinking about building on top of a foundation, I would say the number one tool that we see as being most effective in preventing and providing automated remediation for the issues most likely to lead to a data breach really is that cloud security posture management layer. The way that works is by having kind of continuous real-time visibility onto an environment, bringing all of that infrastructure inventory into one location where it can be analyzed for misconfigurations, policy violations, non-compliance, et cetera, and where that automated remediative action can be taken. And then when we couple that into a holistic strategy, we see that what we really need to think about is combining CSPM with infrastructure as code scanning, with application scanning in production, and with policy enforcement and automated remediation. And sorry, I should have, I missed one bullet point here, which was vulnerability management pre-deployment. Oh, sorry, there it is actually, vulnerability management pre-deployment. Great, so that's kind of, the way we think about a holistic approach to a cloud security strategy, both in the build, planning, and pre-deployment phase, and in the operations phase. So hopefully that's been helpful to understand, what we've learned from the last several years of doing our analysis on the space and also talking to leading organizations. If any of you are interested, please just go to this URL here, DivvyCloud.com/CSCE-Europe. We've got a number of interesting reports here that can help you understand, the impact of misconfiguration and the impact of a holistic strategy, taking a holistic strategy to keep your clouds out of the news, basically, you don't want to be that organization that wakes up to have a cloud breach. And that's it. So hopefully that was helpful for everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. And yeah, there